Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the course of Language Teaching Methodologies. Dear students, the topic of today's lecture is Communicative Language Teaching, and this very lecture is introduction of CLT, and we will learn this very method in detail in the coming lectures also. I'm your teacher, Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Kohat University of Science and Technology. Discussion agenda for today's class is that first of all, I will discuss that why there is a need of new methods in teaching English language. After that, we will study that what is the history of this method which we are going to study, that is communicative language teaching, and we will analyze separately the theory of language behind this method and the theory of learning behind this method, and it will be a very elaborated discussion on this very topic. So this is the discussion for today's class. Starting from this very question that why there is need for new methods in learning languages. So we see that language learning, and especially English language learning and teaching, is always influenced by two interacting sources. These are the sources which are interacting, and the first source of change in these methods is external, whereas the second source of change is internal. The first one is external and the second one is internal. We see that the changing status of the English language in the world is one of the cause of these changes in the language teaching. We see that due to the role of English in the key sectors of the economy, and because of its importance in the different fields of knowledge, there is a vital need to learn this very language, and that has given a special status to this language in the whole world. And on the other side, we see with changing status of English in the world, there is dissatisfaction with the present practices and policies that are being used in teaching and learning of English language. So there is often a perception that these very policies are not providing adequate response to the problems of the teachers and the students, and in this way the language learning is not that much easily happening, and for that reason we feel that there should be a new method to make language teaching more effective. So there are regular reviews of language teaching policies, including the curriculums, and we see the approaches to both teaching and assessments have been reviewed, and that is the feature of the field of language teaching. For that we see changes which are influencing and causing the changes in language teaching methodologies. The second source of this change, which I told you that it is internally initiated source of change, and that is because it reflects upon the language teaching profession that is gradually changing and evolving. Language teaching profession is going through or undergoing a number of waves that are periodical waves of renewal, and we often observe paradigm shifts as it continually reinventing itself through that impact of new ideas new educational philosophies in the field, and we see because of the advancement in the technology and because of new research in this paradigm that has responses, and these responses creates that external pressure that cause to evolve these methods. For that reason, this very movement, this very approach, commonly known as communicative language teaching, is one of the good examples that how this model of teaching or how this paradigm shifts in language teaching. And we have discussed that there are two interacting sources which always influence English language teaching and English language teaching methodologies. Now let's have a look at the history of this method, and we observe that how this evolved. CLT basically is a result of questioning or debating the assumptions and the procedures or the practices that are connected with the SLT. And SLT stands for situational language teaching. Up to the 1960s, the major British approach to teaching English as a second language was situational language teaching. And this was the method that was being used by the major British theorists and teachers for teaching English as a second or foreign language. And CLT is basically the result when the theorists questioned or criticized SLT. In the outcome, we see CLT. So SLT language was taught by practicing basic structures, and these structures were practiced in meaningful situational based activities. So it was different from direct method and audiolingual method, but some of the basic elements of these two methods were included in SLT, where we see that the basic structures of the language were taught in meaningful situation-based activities. But just as we see the linguist theories that were underlying, audiolingualism was rejected in the United States, and the period of rejection of that theory of audiolingualism was mid of 1960s. In the same way, in the British area, applied linguistics began to question the theoretical principles of SLT. So both audiolingual method and SLT was challenged in the mid 1960s. On the one side, we see audiolingualism was very famous in the United States, and here in the British Isles, we see that SLT was dominating, but both these very theories were challenged by the critics. In the same way, we see that an American linguist, one of the prominent American linguists, Noam Chomsky, he criticized the structural linguistic theory. And he leveled this very criticism in his book that is named as Syntactic Structures. And this very book was published in 1957. So Chomsky had showed that the then standard structure theories of the language were incapable of resulting for any fundamental characteristics of language. And so they are not accounting for fundamental characteristics of language, because language was something very different. And the fundamental characteristic of language is the creativity and uniqueness of individual sentences. Every sentence that is being spoken by an individual has its uniqueness, and there is some creativity there. So most of the time we see that these structural theories which are emphasizing the practicing of basic structures, even they are doing these practices in number of ways, and they have devised different activities for that very thing. But actually these very theories are concerned about the standard structures, whereas Chomsky says that these standard structural theories are incapable when we speak about the creativity and uniqueness of individual sentences. So in this way we see that the old theories that were existing in that very time, these very theories were challenged by the critics of the language teaching methodologies. SLT was challenged, audiolingual method was challenged, structural theories were challenged. So all these things were being challenged at that very time. Here we see that British applied linguists, they emphasized another fundamental dimension of language, and this very fundamental aspect was that aspect which was inadequately or which was not properly addressed in approaches to the language teaching at that specific time. And this very dimension of the language is the functional and communicative potential of the language. Which aspect is being neglected in that very time? We see that British applied linguists, they see this very thing, that the functional and communicative potential of the language is inadequately addressed in the approaches to the language teaching. Another thing which is being observed there is that there is need to focus in language teaching on the proficiency in the communicative aspect. So if you are communicatively good, it means that you have learned that very language. Here we will acknowledge Wilkins, who has contributed in an analysis of communicative meaning, that a language learner needs to understand and express. So what is that communicative meaning that a language learner needs to understand and express? That is being analyzed by Wilkins. So he basically demonstrates the system of meanings that is there behind the communicative use of language. He has done this very thing. Instead of describing the core of language through another way, that is the traditional concept of the grammar and vocabulary, he is analyzing language from another perspective, and that is the understanding of system of meanings that lay behind the communicative use of language. So he described two types of meaning, and the first one is notional category of the meanings, and the second one is the communicative functional category of the meanings. Dear students, we see that notional category basically defines the concepts such as the time sequence in the language, and the quantity, location, and the frequency that is being described by the language. That very aspect of the meanings is called the notional category of meanings. On the other side, the category of communicative functions, that basically addresses that very aspect of the meaning where we are learning or teaching requests, denials, offers, complaints, and other such type of meanings in our language. So this is the brief history of this very method, that how CLT evolved and how we see that the critics, and they leveled criticism against the contemporary methods that were being used in that time. Now let's move towards the theory of the language behind CLT. this very method of CLT starts from a communicative model of language and language use. This very model focuses on achieving a communicative purpose. There is negation of the control of structures. Instead of control of structures, focus is on achieving communicative purpose of the language. CLT method tries to transform the focus on achieving communicative purpose into the design and plan for instructional systems and for materials, for teachers and learners' roles and their behaviors, and they also want to put these very ideas into the plans of classroom activities and the procedures and techniques that are used within the classroom. This is the basic theory of the language. Now let's move towards the further discussion on the theory of the language. We see that the communicative approach in language teaching, it starts from the functional theory of the language. And functional theory is that theory that focuses on language as a mean of communication. Basically, functional theory focuses on language as a mean of communication. Dear students, the goal of language teaching is to develop communicative competence. In CLT, the goal of language teaching is to develop communicative competence. And this very term is very, very vital term in CLT. So the goal of language teaching is to develop communicative competence, and Hayam's view that a person who acquires this communicative competence acquires both knowledge and ability for language use. So it means that just mastering the structures of that language or having the knowledge of the grammar, vocabulary or pronunciation or other aspects of that language is not enough. Actually, communicative competence, that is the ability to use this language, that is very necessary. So this is the view that is being given by Hayams. And this very term of communicative competence was actually coined by Hayams. So with him we see the views of Chomsky, and for Chomsky the focus of the linguistic theory was to characterize the abstract abilities of the speaker's processes. So he is basically viewing this very language with other characteristics, and he is just focusing on the abstract abilities of the speaker, and these very abilities enable the speaker to produce grammatically correct sentences in the language. So Chomsky's theory was based on the cognitive view of language, and that is having a relation to the brain of human beings. Here we see that Hines brings a functional theory of the language that is a little bit different from the Chomsky, but some of the ideas of these two scholars of the language have similarities too. And the idea of the communicative competence is one of the main ideas that has been given by Hayams. Now let's see that how other theories influence CLT. Another linguistic theory of communication that favored CLT theory was Holliday's functional account of language use, and we see that he explained this term functional account of language on the basis of the theory of Hayams. Actually, he expanded the theory of Hayams to encompass the categories given below, as well as he included the aspect of speech acts. And that is another term and that was used by Wilkins to describe what we do with language. Like as I told you that Wilkins expressed two categories of meanings, and the first one was the notional category, and the second one was the category of communication, where we see that we understand the communicative function of the language that is being described in the requests, denials, offers, and complaints. So here we see that he expanded the functional account of language use as well as the concept of speech acts. So linguistics is concerned with the description of speech acts or texts, since only through the study of the language in use are all the functions of the language, and therefore all components of the meaning brought into the focus when we are studying these speech acts. Hollidays elaborated and explained a powerful theory of the functions of language. There is complete theory of functions of language that is being elaborated by Hollidays. And this theory basically complements and supports the Himes view of communicative competence. Now let's look into detail the Hollidays theory of the functions of language. He described 7 basic functions that any language performs for children when they are learning their L1. These 7 functions are: the first function is instrumental function, and from this he means when a child uses language to get things, that is the instrumental function. The second basic function that language performs is the regulatory function, and it is that function which child uses when he tries to control the behaviors of the other. The third very function of the language is interactional function, and it is in using language to create interaction with others. When we are interacting with others, it is basically the interactional function of the language which we are using at that time. Then we have another function, and that is the personal function. When we use language to express our personal feelings and to express these very feelings into the meanings, then we are actually using the personal function of the language. A heuristic function is another important function of the language, and this very function is used to learn and discover new ideas, concepts, and beliefs. So imaginative function is another function, and it is used to create a world of imagination. Whatever is happening in our mind and whatever is the range of imagination, all these things needs a language, and for that reason, when we use language, that is imaginative function of the language. Representational function is the last function that is being described by Hollidays, and this very function is using language to communicate information. So these are the 7 basic functions of the language that language performs for children learning their L1. So learning second language is also treated similarly, and it is viewed similarly by the main practitioners of CLT, because they consider that when we are learning second language or foreign language, language do same type of functions for a new learner. Now let's observe some other dimensions of these theories of language. We see that Cannell and Swan, these two theorists of the language, they identified 4 dimensions of the communicative competence. Before that, we were looking at the basic functions that language performs. Now let's further explore the dimensions of the language, and here we see that they are describing the dimensions of communicative competence. They have identified 4 dimensions. The first one is grammatical competence, and the second one is social linguistic competence, the third one is discourse competence, and the fourth one is strategic competence. So grammatical competence refers to, as Chomsky calls, linguistic competence, and what Himes described by what is formally possible by a language, and it is the domain of grammatical and lexical capacity of an individual. So for Chomsky, it is linguistic competence, and for Himes, it is grammatical and lexical capability. Now let's move towards the social linguistic competence, and this very competence refers to understanding of the social context in which that communication takes place. It includes the role relationship, and it also includes the shared information of the participants, and the third thing which this social linguistic competence includes or refers to is the communicative purpose for their interaction. So there are 3 things that include in this very social linguistic competence. That is the role relationship, and the second one is shared information of the participants, and the third thing is communicative purpose of their interaction. Now let's move towards the third dimension of the communicative competence, and this very dimension is the discourse competence, and it refers to the interpretation of individual message elements in terms of their interconnectedness, and how meanings are represented in relation to the entire text or entire discourse. Individual message is defined in terms of their connectedness with the meanings of the entire discourse. The last dimension being expressed by these 2 theorists is that of strategic competence, and it refers to those copying strategies that communicators normally use to initiate or to stop or to maintain or repair or redirect the communication. When we are doing these very actions, we are using some strategies, and these very strategies are known as strategic competence of that learner, through which he initiates, terminates, maintain, repair or redirect communication. Dear students, we see that there are so many discussions on this very term, that communicative competence, and that is just because of the usefulness of the notion. And we see that many people, they attempted to refine this very notion of communicative competence, because it is very useful term. And for that reason, we have number of other explanations of this very term, but we are ending up our discussion on just these 4 dimensions. So let's move to another aspect of the theory of language, and at the level of language theory, we see that CLT has a very rich base, but this base has very diverse and free theoretical foundations. but I will just give you some of the characteristics of this communicative view of language, and these views of language follow these very principles. That first one is that language is a system for the expression of meanings. What is language? The definition is a little bit different. Language is a system for the expression of the meaning. The second important characteristic of the communicative view of language is that the primary function of language is to allow interaction and communication. So most important thing for these very theorists was that function of the language that is connected to the interaction and communication. And they believe that the structure of language basically represents the functional and communicative uses. To CLT theorists, the primary units of language are not only its grammatical or structural features, but declare this very thing, that categories of the functional and communicative meanings that are exemplified in the discourse, that are also the primary units of the language. So dear students, and these are some of the characteristics. Let's move forward and examine some other important characteristics of the theory of the language of CLT. And the fifth characteristic of the communicative view of language is that communicative competence needs knowing how to use language for a range of different purposes and functions. So that is the important view of the language according to the CLT theorists, that communicative competence is needed to know how to use language for a number of purposes and functions, as well as the following dimensions of the knowledge. And that very thing is knowing how to vary the use of language according to different situations and according to the participants and that very communication. So that thing is very important, and that the communicator should know when to use formal language or informal speech. That is very important, and that will be decided by the setting in which you are present, or the person or the participant with whom you are discussing this very thing. That is very important in deciding this very role. And the second thing is to know that very thing, that when to use language that is appropriate for written style as opposed to the spoken communication. So learners should have a clear distinction between using language in different settings and with different participants. He should know how to produce and understand different types of texts. For example, he should have that very capability to produce and understand the narratives, to produce and understand reports and the conversations that are being used in interviews and other oral conversations. In the same way, knowing how to maintain communication despite having limitations in one's language knowledge, for example, through using different kind of communication strategies, we can maintain communication though we are not having sufficient knowledge of the language. If the learner master these very strategies, it will be very easy for him to get that communicative competence that is needed for mastering language. So these are some of the characteristics of the communicative view of language. Now let's move towards the theory of learning, and I will give you a brief explanation of the theory of learning behind CLT. So elements of underlying learning theory can be identified in some of the CLT practices. One of such element might be described as communication principle, and the second element that is underlying learning theory of CLT is the task principle. The third one is the meaningfulness principle. The first principle that is described as communication principle, it includes activities that involves real communication, and this real communication promotes learning. The second element is the task principle, and it includes activities in which language is used for carrying out meaningful tasks, and in this way it promotes language learning. The third element that is underlying the learning theory of CLT practices is the meaningfulness principle, and it means that language is used that is meaningful to the learner, and in this way, if the language is meaningful to the learner, it supports the learning process. So learning activities are consequently selected according to how well they engage the learner in meaningful and authentic language use. Instead of just mechanically practicing different language patterns, here we see that they are selecting learning activities according to how well they engage the learner into a meaningful and authentic use of language. So these very principles are being deducted from different CLT practices, and these principles are communicative principle, the task principle, and the meaningfulness principle. Now let's move towards the later account of CLT, where we see that CLT identifies theories of language learning processes that are very much compatible with the communicative approach. And we see that Savignon surveyed the second language acquisition research as a source for learning theories, and he describes the role of linguistic, social, cognitive, and individual variables in language acquisition. In the same way, Johnson and Littlewood, they also suggested an alternative learning theory that they also observed compatible with CLT, and that very model was the skilled learning model of learning. And according to this very model, the acquisition of communicative competence in language is an example of skill development. So to them, communicative competence is equal to skill development. This involves both the cognitive and behavioral aspect of language learning. And when we discuss the cognitive aspect, it involves internalization of plans for creating appropriate behaviors for language use. And these plans derive mainly from the language system, and they include grammatical rules, procedures for selecting vocabulary, and social conventions that are governing speech. So cognitive aspect, that is connected with brain, and actually these very theorists to whom communicative competence in language is like skill development, cognitive aspect or the internalization of some of the behaviors is very important. And the behavioral aspect involves the automation of these very plans or these very activities, so that they can convert into fluent performance in real life. And these two aspects were suggested by Johnson and Littlewood. They proposed the learning theory that is based on skill learning model. Now let's have a look at other learning theories that can be cited to support this communicative language theory. And these very theories are the creative construction hypothesis and interactional theory, and socio-cultural learning theory. From the above mentioned perspectives, language learning is seen to be an outcome from the processes of the following kinds, like interaction between learners and users of the language, or it is a process of collaborative creation of meanings, or it is something that is creating meaningful and purposeful interaction through language, or we can say that they viewed language learning as a negotiation of meaning as the learner and his or her interlocutors arrive at understanding. They also believe learning through attending to the feedback when they use the language. And they are specifically focusing on paying attention to the language one hears, that is the input, and when he is trying to incorporate new forms into one's own language, and through this he develops his communicative competence. Another thing is that trying out and experimenting with different ways of saying things. For example, when you learn something and you experiment and try to add some more information or some more vocabulary or some more meaningful concepts within the same very utterance, actually you are experimenting with that very thing. So that is another way of processing. In the same way, learning as a social mediation between the learner and another person, during which we see that socially acquired knowledge become internal to the learner. Actually, this is the process where the learner internalize knowledge of the society. And the last thing that is about this processing is that learning through collaborative dialogues centering on the structured cooperative task is very important for these learning theories. This is all about the introductory lecture on the communicative language teaching, and in today's lecture we have discussed that why there is need for new methods in teaching and learning of English language, and then we discussed the history of this CLT method, and then after that initial discussion we have a detailed discussion on the theory of the language of CLT and the theory of learning of CLT. So this very discussion will help you in understanding the basic concepts of the CLT and what is special about this theory. So I hope that you will be having basic information about this theory, and in this way we have revised general concepts about the theory of the language and the theory of the learning. So thank you very much. Allah Hafiz.